community support like speakers and our friends like yourself. Thank you so much for that.
No
And
problems. Yeah.
Rami, if you yeah, you already told you are not going to share screen, so we are good. And it's stage is yours. I will be on backstage. I will be assisting in when you need or when we have questions. Thank you so
Sounds
much.
great.
And thanks.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for joining. I'm Rami, and today, as Yawar was mentioning, or as I was talking to him in the backstage, I'm not going to be sharing any screens. I'm not going to be sharing any slides. But at the same time, I'm not just going to be talking to the camera. I'm going to use new techniques that are used in the news. So usually, you have the news anchors talking to you through a TV, but usually they do a very good job transmitting a message. And I'm going to try and mimic that. And I'll talk about that in the beginning of this presentation, and then I'll go into the main subject of this presentation. So first of all, let me quickly introduce myself. I am Rami. I am from New Zealand. I am one of the MVPs in New Zealand, the business application sort of category. I've been an MVP since 2015, and I'm quite active in the New Zealand community, but also across the world. If you follow me on LinkedIn, you might have seen my Street Fighter theme. So a lot of people call me Mr. Street Fighter. I don't know why. Although, as you can see in here, this is sort of inspired by the Street Fighter game. And what I'm trying to do is go around the world in different countries, starting in New Zealand and then going into Pakistan and then going into Singapore. And next, hopefully, I'll go to India and Australia and so on, virtually, just to share my passion on how to become a better presenter. So if you guys are interested in that, I've got a little video on YouTube that describes how I'm doing that. But right behind me, there's a green screen. You can't see it because I'm using a software called OBS that would add my slides in between the green screen and myself. That's why you see me, and then you see the slides behind me. I've got the little link in there, so you can follow that. It's a bit.ly Better Presentation 1. Follow that and then have a look at how I'm doing this magic. And hopefully that will create a more engaging presentation where I actually don't have to go and play around with technology, sharing screens and so on. Most of what I have is static anyway. So the topic that I'm going to talk today about is security and the Power Platform. So this topic has evolved over the years. I've done it in the past, but every time I present that, there's something new that I introduce in it, a new capability that is available that will make your environment more secure. So one thing that we are going to try and avoid is to be in the front page of a newspaper where they say, because of the company that you're working for, there's been a security breach, and now this information is available to the public. I am based in Wellington. Wellington is the political capital of New Zealand, and this is where all the government departments are. So most of my customers are government departments. And you can imagine if there is a security leak related to some information related to the government or related to the population, the citizens, then this is going to be front page in a newspaper, and a lot of people's privacy is going to be breached. And that's why in the company that I work for, DXC, and me as a professional, I take security very, very seriously. But then when you have a look at the numbers, you're going to be quite shocked. There's actually 92 attacks happening every 60 minutes. Every hour, there are 92 attacks that are happening. And the top locations where the security attacks are targeting is government, retail, and technology. Technology as in IT companies. So we've heard a lot about, WikiLeaks, where information is leaked out of an organization. We heard a lot about ransomware. So this is where they encrypt the data on your machines, and then you have to go and pay them money so that they can unencrypt it, and otherwise you cannot do business and so on. So there are lots of attacks that happen all the time. So basically, this is costing the industry $124 billion of loss just because they've been attacked, their security has been breached, and they have to go and fix it. So it's a big deal. So hopefully, by the end of this presentation, you will learn a few security controls that will help you avoid losing money and avoid being attacked. All right, so let's have a look at the different types of controls that we've got. So first of all, you've got the Azure level that will look after your entire tenancy. So all the information that you've got be it in Dynamics, be it in Microsoft, be it anywhere, Azure will give you that coarse-grained security controls that you can apply, who can access it, who cannot access it, how do you access it, and so on. A layer below that is the Microsoft 365 layer. And in there, you can have group policies and security at the user level, licensing, assignment, and so on that will deny or allow you access to specific environments. And as we go deeper, we can look at the actual Dynamics 365 security roles that can be implemented in there. So my specialty is Dynamics 365 CE and the Power Platform. So I'm not necessarily going to focus on FNO, although some of those controls can be applied in there. Cool. So let's have a look at the different types of security. So the first one is preventative. So this is where you use security roles, encryption, just to stop people from not gaining access to something that is secure. It's very high level. The second one is detective. If there has been an attack, how can we detect it? And that is related, for example, to denial of service. So if someone sends a lot of requests into your servers to the point where they cannot respond anymore, this is called denial of service. A malware attack, for example. All of that has detection mechanisms. So we can detect that this attack is happening, and then we can block it. And the last one is corrective. Once it has happened, what can we do to rectify it? So customer notification is that there has been an attack, there is a breach, we need to know about it. And the second one is that something has changed. We don't know what, but we have audit trails that would allow us to do forensic checks to see what has changed and who has changed it, and so on. Cool. So typically when we think about security, we think, all right, in Dynamics 365 CE, we've got that thing called users, there's security roles, maybe there's teams. We go and define the security access in there, and that's it. Well, this is the very, very simplest way of dealing with security. And as you can see, I've got an old screenshot of the admin center, whereas right now this has evolved into something new in the Maker experience. However, what's really interesting is that Microsoft is working really hard to move everything that is in the classic user interface, as you can see in the screenshots in there, and moving into the new modern Maker experience. And you will notice that a lot of my screenshots are only in the classic interface. That's because Microsoft has not moved those to the latest and the greatest user interface, meaning that if it's working and there is a way of actually addressing it and it's not used that often, then you can use the classic interface. But if you have read the latest release notes, you will notice that Microsoft has actually introduced a few items in there saying that most of the stuff that you will see in my presentation will eventually make it into the Maker experience within the next 6 months, which is great news for us. All right, so let's have a look at the different levels. So as I said, at the Azure level, you can do high-level things like detecting denial of service and stopping it from happening. You can do IP whitelisting, which means that a range of IP addresses that define, for example, a region, a country, a data center, or a house, for example, can be whitelisted, and you say only those IP addresses can access my environment, and that helps a lot. And if you're outside of that, you can either block it using Azure Conditional Access, or you can say, all right, well, anything outside of my network needs multi-factor authentication. So this is the tokens that you usually get on your cell phone. You would get a message, or you get an authenticator to say, yep, this is me. And then it's a two-factor authentication, stopping people from accessing your environment if they, for example, know your password. The second level is the Office 365 or the Microsoft 365, where we can control security using licenses and security groups. And I'll talk about that in a second. And the last one is the D365. As I showed before, security roles, security profiles, access teams, which is quite granular and it's a really powerful feature, and team sharing, which has evolved tremendously over time. So I'll talk about all of those in my presentation. All right, first of all, starting with Azure, the high-level coarse-grained environment. For the rest of the presentation, I'm going to talk about a security requirement, and based on that security requirement, I'll have a look at what is the control to address that requirement. And it would look something like that. Security requirement number 1, for example, and it would say application security must not be compromised when accessed outside of the network, right? So if someone is accessing outside of your IP range address, then we need to make sure that security is not compromised, that not anybody can access it. And if something goes wrong, there's a way of actually controlling it or stopping it. So in order to do that, as I mentioned, we use conditional access. So in Azure, you will be able to see that there is a line that is related to Dynamics CRM Online, which is the legacy name of Dynamics 365 CE or the Power Platform or Dataverse. So this is what it would look like, and it will have an object ID and an application ID. And using that, you can use conditional access. So for this specific application, you can say, I want to introduce conditional access. So if the users, for example, are included in a specific environment, then they can access it. Otherwise, multi-factor authentication is required, or otherwise, access is denied. You can also do it at the platform level. So you can say, if someone is using Mac OS, stop them from accessing this environment. If someone is using Android, for example, or using a Windows phone, iOS, whatever it is that you want to stop the access from, you can define it at that level. So this will allow you to control devices. The next one that we've got in here is related to the location, and this is detected based on the IP addresses. So you can say if the IP address is within that, then either deny it, so exclude it, include it, or request multi-factor authentication, and so on. And in here, you can, so this is the bit that I was saying, you can either block access or you can grant access with a few conditions associated with it. Cool. Security requirement number 2 might say, I must be able to connect to my instance programmatically and securely without the need for any interactive username and password. So this is typically used for application-to-application integration, where you don't want a specific username and password to be used in order to connect to that application securely. For that, you use something called service principal. And to use service principals, you basically create what we call an application user. So an application user is created in the Azure space, and you define what type of application, web app, API. And then in there, you'll be able to create a key. And that key might have an expiration date or might be indefinite. So you'll have the application ID and you have a secret key. With those two items, you can programmatically connect to the environment with that application user. So this is a screenshot of the new Maker experience. And you will notice in here that under security user plus permissions, so the settings of your environment, this is under admin.powerplatform.com. You will be able to see that there is a new item called application user. When you click on that, it will ask you for the application ID. And then based on that, you can give it a security value. You can give it a security role. And then once you've got that, then programmatically, you can go and call the client credentials. You can pass the client ID secret, and the application will automatically know, oh, this is a service principal. I know what it is. I know what security roles it has. I know what access it has. Then I'll allow it. This is becoming the standard for machine-to-machine integration, especially if you're using things like Power Automate, Logic Apps, and some of the more advanced integration techniques. Even if you're using the web API, custom pages, and so on, use service principals. Do not use username and passwords. However, if you do use usernames and passwords and you've got a normal account, just make sure that at admin, you create that user as non-interactive, because then you don't have to assign them a Dynamics license, and then you can save that license for an actual person. So if you want, integration users will come for free, so you don't have to pay for that specific individual license or that specific user license. Cool. Now from Azure, we're going to move into the Microsoft 365 space. So let's have a look at what access can we get out of Microsoft 365. So security requirement number 3 might say administrators must be able to manage access from a centralized location, either Microsoft 365 or Active Directory. And this can be done, first of all, using the licenses. So a user will not have access to an environment if they do not have a license. This is a very easy way to say, all right, well, that user has left my organization. I'm going to revoke their license, first of all, because they don't need it and I can reassign it to someone else. But second, if that license is removed, then the user is definitely not going to get access to the environment anymore. The user will not display as an option to be added into an environment. However, if they are already existing in there, so they previously had access, that user will be disabled for historical purposes. So if the user has done some changes in the environment when they were active in that environment, the audit trails will all be linked to that specific user. And you will see the history of who changed those records, and that name will display in there. So the user will never be deleted from the environment. It will only be disabled. So you can still track them back and see what changes they've done in the past, but they won't be able to access the environment anymore. Cool. Another thing you can do is create a Microsoft 365 security group. So those groups can be created within the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. And you can say, all right, within that group, I've got a number of individuals. So you can just go and add them in there. You can potentially do that programmatically. So if they belong to that Active Directory security group, then add them into the Office 365 or Microsoft 365 group as well. And then by doing that, you can basically go into the admin center for your Power Platform environment and say, for this specific instance that I've got, so in my example is instance30.crm.dynamics.com, I have that security group which whitelists the user that have access to my environment. So no one else will be able to access it unless they are part of that security group. So you go there into your environment, you look at the details, you click on edit, and then you can go and add a security group in there. Again, as people move on from this sort of organization or do not need access to that instance anymore, all you have to do is remove them from that security group. This gives you a more flexibility if you want, so that you don't have to worry too much about the coarse grain. Do I have access to all Dynamics instances or none of them at all? No, this one will allow you to whitelist each instance individually. That's really useful if you're doing, for example, you're working on an environment that might have some sensitive information. So it could be, for example, a data migration environment that has live data. You don't want everybody to see it, so you just whitelist the individuals that have access to it. Or it could be a production environment, and then you say, all right, only the people that should have access to the production environment can actually be in that list, so I only whitelist them and no one else. Very useful. Now, one thing I'd like to add, and this is not necessarily new, but it hasn't been in any of my previous presentations that I've done. It has been around maybe for a year. In Dynamics 365 or in the Power Platform, when you create a team, so a team is basically just a shell that belongs to a specific business unit and has a security role. Any individual that belongs into that team inherits all the security that comes with that specific team. I'll talk a little bit more later in the presentation about Dynamics 365 teams and how they can be used in specific scenarios. But in this example, when you click on create a new team, you have something called team type. It can be owner, it can be access, or it can be AD security group or AD office group, which means that now if you say AD security group, then that links to an AD security group in Active Directory, in Azure Active Directory specifically. So any user that is added into that Active Directory security group will automatically appear in that team in Dynamics and will also automatically be assigned that security role that the team owns, meaning that they will inherit all the access that that team has. This is a very powerful type of security control, which allows you to control everything within AD security groups, as opposed to going to have and do it in the platform itself and going from one environment to the other. A lot of organizations have automatic sort of systems that allow you to request access into a specific AD security group. And then once you've got that, then that automatically adds you into Dynamics 365. Check out this feature. It's actually quite a cool feature. Cool. Now let's go into Dynamics 365, or as I would like to call it, the Power Platform. And basically anything that I talk about in Dynamics 365 is also going to cover Power Apps, Power Automate, Power Virtual Agent, Dataverse, and so on, because they all more or less inherit the same security roles or the same security structure that is sort of dependent on the Dataverse and the security controls or the security principles, if you want, of Dataverse. So let's have a look at maybe a new requirement. Requirement number 4. Administrators must be able to control the default session timeout. This is actually quite an interesting one, because as we know it, the session can stay alive for more than 24 hours. So if I log in once, and then, for example, I forget to lock my screen, someone else can come in and then start using my environment. Even if they manage to unlock my screen in whatever way, they can just click on my instance of Dynamics 365, and it's not going to prompt for any username and passwords because it knows who I am, and it will automatically sort of allow me to access it. A very good example, and I don't know if that's the case anymore, but if you go into a public environment, let's say a internet cafe, you go there, you log in into this computer. This is not your session. That has nothing to do with your user, but you open a browser and then you log in into Dynamics 365. And then once you're done with it, you either close it or you forget to close it. For example, someone else uses that session, then they can go back into your history, access Dynamics 365, and then be able to see your work. So this is where you can control the session timeout. Now, this is a very good example where you can only do that in the old classic interface. So there's a place called the maximum session length. You define the number of minutes in there, and basically once that is reached, then it will challenge you to log in again into the environment. Cool. Security requirement number 5. All users in their business units have read-write access, which is quite usual. Account data, for example, mastered elsewhere is read-only. So you want to have some data that is coming from a different environment, and anything coming from that environment needs to be read-only. No one should be able to edit it because the source of truth is somewhere else. And the third one is that some accounts and contacts are considered sensitive. So there's some records that I want to put into a sensitive bucket. So this requirement is easily addressable by leveraging the capability of business units. So what we would have in here is this hierarchy. The root business unit that comes out of the box with every single instance that you're creating in Dynamics 365 or Dataverse, a main business unit and a sensitive business unit. And on the main, you can have a read-only business unit. Now, remember that business units do not necessarily have to follow your business unit structure and your organization. They can be anything that makes sense from a security perspective from Dynamics 365, not necessarily your business unit structure in your organization. So basically by doing that, you would say, all right, well, I've got main. Most of my users will be in main, and everybody in here will have read access at this organization, at this business unit only, and they have read at the parent child, so main, and at the read-only business unit. So write only at the main one, but then read at the main and at the read-only level. But then they won't be able to have access to anything that is in the sensitive business unit because it's the other side. Now, how do you give some people access to the sensitive data that is available on the other side and make sure that they actually can access it? The way you do it is to create a team. So you create a team, you give that team write access at this business unit and read access at this business unit and lower. And then if you want to add individuals into that team, you just add them to the team. And remember what I said earlier about using AD security groups to add people into a team. So that can also be managed using AD, not necessarily having to do it manually within your platform. So that way, all your users will have read-write access to the main business unit, read to the read-only business unit, and then some of them can be added into that team so that they can have read-write access into everything that is sensitive. Now, if you're working on an implementation, I always strongly recommend that you create a child business unit other than the root one. And that's because if you create that, then you're future-proofing your implementation to allow people to have access into a very sort of elaborate business unit structure similar to that one. If you put everybody at the root level, then this requirement is compromised. You're not future-proofing your environment. So think about it. Otherwise, you'll have to do a lot of, what we call data migration. So you have to go and move all the records from the root business unit to the main business unit. You have to move the users from the root to the main one. When you do that, they're going to lose their security access, and then you have to go and edit again. So it's quite a lot of work. Whereas if you do it up front, then you address that requirement nicely. All right, security requirement number 6. Some fields must be read-only, only some. So typically you would have a form and you would say, all right, I want to do some of those fields on that form as read-only. Okay, well, you can do it in 2 ways. The first one is you can do it with JavaScript. So basically making sure that, when I load that form, make that field read-only. The problem with that is that this has a lot of what we call backdoors. So someone that can use Power Automate can go and change that data. Someone that can use, for example, Natraj's Dynamics 365 Level Up. So this is a little add-on that you can add on Chrome, and it gives you all those options. And one of them is God mode. When you click on God mode, everything that is read-only on the form becomes editable. Because it's only JavaScript and it's only client-side, the server side will accept whatever changes you do. So be very careful if you're doing JavaScript-only security-related changes, because they are backdoors. Another backdoor would be using the APIs. Another backdoor would be writing a console application that calls the SDK. So just be careful about only using JavaScript for security, because someone with a little bit of knowledge will be able to hack it, no issues at all. So my preferred way of doing it is using field-level security, or by normalizing your model. And I'll talk a little bit about normalization later. All right, security requirement number 7. Records are read-only, but some fields editable. So this is the opposite of the other one. So usually the record is locked, but then I want some fields that I want to be able to edit. And again, as I said, this is done using normalization. So I have an account, for example. I've got a separate many-to-one relationship to the editable data. So this is a lookup into another record. And then given that I have a lookup, I can have a little form in there, a quick form, and that will show all the editable data. And if I want to go and edit them, I don't edit the account, which is read-only, but some of those fields in the editable data table will be able to be modified because they have a relationship to accounts. So normalizing your data always helps with the security controls in the environment. All right, moving on to requirement number 8. All data is locked down by default. Users are added as a role to an account, which will dictate subsequent access. And then number 3, administrators must be able to report on and manage access to cases, for example. So basically what we're saying in here is that by default, no one has access to anything. You are only invited to get access into a specific record. And to do that, you use access teams. Access teams basically define for a specific environment, so this is the access team templates, for a specific record, accounts for example, if I am part of that team on that record, so not for all of them, just on that specific record, then I can read, or then I can write, or then I can append and delete, and so on. So basically this becomes very, very granular, and it's applied on the record itself as opposed to the entire entity. It's very powerful capability. And the way you actually display who has access and who doesn't is by adding that subgrid onto your specific record. So you say, okay, for accounts, I know I have access teams. I'm going to add that subgrid in there, and then that is going to give me access to that specific record. Very granular. And that is, I've used that quite a lot in some of my really, really sensitive customers. So things where, for example, if you know information that you should not know, someone will get in danger. This is court information. It might be privacy information, very, very sensitive. Police information, for example. Only people working on the case should be able to have access onto that record and nothing else. So you have to clear the conflict of interest first. And then once this is cleared, then you can move into your next stage. So access teams is the way to go. Security requirement number 9, user interface must take context into consideration. So user security roles. So basically, if I go into an app, so we know in Dynamics 365, you can create different apps on top of the same instance, then only specific security roles can do that. And this is done using the manage roles of your specific application. Now, once again, this is the old interface. They haven't moved it into the new environment as far as I know, but that's the way to do it. You click on manage roles, you define which roles have access to that specific application, and then they will get access by default, which is a great way of dealing with it. All right, security requirement number 10. User activities might be audited for forensic purposes. So this is using the audit capabilities. It's out of the box, and it allows you to see what's happening. Now, one thing that is not always available is if someone accesses a record that they should not have access to. For example, they click on a URL, or they try and put in a GUID in the URL, and they try to access that record. As far as I know, this is not currently monitored. So it's something to consider as well moving forward. Cool. Now let's go into mobility. Looking at mobile devices. and specifically in the sort of Microsoft space. Actually, I'm going to skip mobility, given that we've only got 10 minutes left. So I'm going to tell you about some of the capabilities that Microsoft gives you out of the box. So those are things that you don't really have to worry about. They're just available based on the implementation that you're doing with Microsoft. So the first one is, a security requirement, again, going through that. So the data must be encrypted at rest. So making sure that wherever your data resides, it has to be encrypted so you don't have any issues moving forward. And for that, Microsoft actually uses TDE, which is a SQL Server encryption capability that makes sure that all the data that is available on their machines is encrypted. So even Microsoft will not be able to access that data if they want to. That's because they do not have access to those keys. If someone, for example, steals a hard drive that has those databases on them, they won't be able to recover that data because it's all encrypted using TDE. And the good thing is that you can bring your own key. So if you don't trust Microsoft to hold that key, you can bring your own, you can put in your own key in there, and then that will encrypt your data using your key. But then be very careful about that, because if that key is lost, then that's it. You cannot recover that data, and you might potentially lose access to your entire environment. So there's a lot of warnings as you're actually doing that. A similar requirement would be data must be encrypted in transit. And for that, Microsoft is using TLS 1.2 for any traffic that is happening into the environment and out of that environment. So TLS 1.2 HTTPS basically is what it's currently using. Awesome. Now, this is a map of the world where sort of all the data centers are available. So if I move a little bit over here, so you might see that, typically I'm New Zealand based. So in New Zealand, there's a new data center that has been sort of implemented. This is going to be available around 2023, if I'm not mistaken. And that will allow us a lot of really cool capabilities because a lot of our government is always asking for the data to be on New Zealand soils. So they accept near shore, which is Australia. So those are the data centers that are in here. And most of my customers are actually using Australia East or Australia Southeast. But once the New Zealand data center is going to be there, then everybody is going to move into those New Zealand data centers. So this is great news for us. We do have a specific requirements for very sensitive data to make sure that that data cannot even go into Australia. What they consider part of a citizen's identity. So, for example, their birth registration, their passport registration, citizenship registration, all of that cannot go overseas. And that's why we use local data centers by big companies to actually store that data. So it's important to know where your data is, where is it being replicated, and what happens to it, just in case your customer is very critical about where the data goes. But it's also important to know what capabilities are available in your data centers. So as you can see in here, this is a list. You can go to that URL at the top right here, and then you can go and have a look at any service that Azure provides and understand where is that service hosted. What's really important is that some AI capabilities are not available in all the data centers. And for example, you've got speaker recognition. So this is a preview that is only available in West US, right? There might be custom vision. Custom vision is only available in Australia East, but it's not available in Australia Southeast or Central US. Understand where is your data going. So for example, if you go and tell one of your customers, oh, we've got speech recognition, and this is quite an amazing capability, and it's using maybe Bing speech, for example, in the backend, know that that data is actually being transferred all the way to the US in one of the data centers that does have the capability, changed in there, and then sent back. And your customer might not be comfortable with that if, for example, the data or the speeches that they're trying to convert into text might have some sensitive information. So understand where the services are located and what impact that has onto your customers. But just to be on the safe side, Microsoft publishes its Dynamics 365 Security Trust Center policy. And basically, that's telling you that they make a lot of effort to follow a lot of the ISO standards. So here, there's ISO certifications, physical security, and the logical separation of all the environments. They do have a lot of standards that they have to follow they get audited on a yearly basis just to make sure that they still maintain that level of security that they mentioned. And every time they get audited, they get issued a new certificate that gives them the ISO certification, basically telling them you are following ISO, whatever the number is, which is the international standard for this security. And that means that you are secure at that level. So they have to keep on top of them, and they have to make sure that they've got everything up to standard. And if there is a security breach, it is their responsibility to actually go and tell you that there's been a security breach. So there's a breach protocol that they have to follow. I've been into one of the Microsoft data centers. That's not it, but it looks very similar to that, and it's mind-blowing. The one that I went to was in Redmond, and it had 9 screens at the top, as you can see, and they're giving you telemetry about everything that is happening. They actually didn't allow us to go and take pictures into that room, so they asked us to leave our cell phones outside, but it was a very serious room. It looked like something coming out of a sci-fi movie. So that was a really, really interesting environment that we went into. So yeah, they do take their security seriously, and then they monitor it on an ongoing basis. We're getting to the end of our presentation, so I probably have just a couple of slides. So security requirement number 12, where I just talked about the vendor must inform us in case of a security breach, and Microsoft actually has the protocols to actually go and inform their customers if anything has happened. So there's a white paper that has been written maybe about 5 years ago on security modeling for Dynamics CRM 2016. It's still valid. If you're interested in it and you want to do something at a large scale, read that white paper. It actually gives you quite a lot of useful information. Some honorable mentions that I didn't have time, just with 2 minutes left to finish this presentation. Field level security, briefly mentioned them. Great tool. Use them whenever you need to lock something at the field level. Data management encryption, so bring your own key. You can do that as well. SharePoint integration is a whole conversation on the side that has quite a lot of security concerns, but it does have some ways of actually making sure that it does work. And then using DLP or secure connectors and policies to better improve your access to your environment is another story. And there's also the concept of virtual entities, where your data is coming from a different environment, and how do you secure that? Again, all those are quite large topics that I didn't have access or time to talk about today. But maybe in a future session, I'll be able to cover some of those. So this is sort of a very high-level capability of all the different bits that security touches. But again, it's a generic slide. Probably won't have to be able to go through all the different details, but security covers all the different levels, from the logical, the data, the storage, and the integration level as well. Cool, and that's me. This is the end of my presentation. I'm not sure, Yawar, there were any questions left in there? You're on mute.
First of all, Rami, thank you so much. It was really awesome. I mean, the way security is important, and we are doing a lot of enterprise scale applications, means a lot of data is coming into Dataverse. Of course, that is security is a major concern. And the way you have summarized all the options, a few areas where people can go and tweak and learn more, they are really, really awesome. Thank you so much for that. From question side, I have received one question. Hamza is asking, can you please guide some steps of how we can consume web API in model-driven app?
In model-driven app, consuming web APIs.
Probably asking about security, like how security can be managed. I know it can be detailed, but if you want to take this question, feel free. Otherwise, we can take it later from your social media.
I'll just give a quick idea. So web APIs using model-driven will be using the context of the user that is sort of currently logged in. However, you can do impersonation to go and change it. The details are available out there, but if you want more details, just hit me up on LinkedIn, and then I'll be able to support you in that space.
Thank you so much, Rami. I think from questions and we are fine. We don't have any more questions, and I can see a good number of audience are watching this session. Please feel free, get connected with Rami on Twitter or LinkedIn, and if you have any questions, please feel free and ask Rami. I hope Rami will able to help if you approach if Rami has time. That was so nice of you. Thank you so much, Rami. And with
You're welcome.
that. I hope we will see you again sometime. It was really, really awesome. Really enjoyed, really full of knowledge, and thanks for sharing your experience.
Awesome. Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you.
Enjoy the rest of
Thanks.
the
Take care.
conference.
Take care. Bye,
Cheers.
Rami.
Bye.
Cheers. That was Rami with us. Rami has presented really very nicely security, how we can handle security in Power Platform, particularly in Dynamics 365 apps. Our next speaker will be Lynn just has arrived. We'll need to start in a couple of minutes. I will hold this call here for a minute, and soon we will have Lynn. Thank you so much, and please stay with us. Thank you.